Welcome to the 8th episode of Rethinking Religion. I'm happy to see you again, John, and I'm glad you didn't explode Layman. In our conversation so far, we've mostly been speaking from our respective orientations rather than about them. I think we've generally just wanted to think together about our shared concerns rather than comparing systems. And I think that's served our conversation well. But for today, since one of the things we're going to consider is what kinds of practices are essential for a viable ecology of practice, I wanted to take a moment to outline the integral post-metaphysical spiritual orientation that Layman and I have been involved in and describe what some of its core features are. So as integral, it aims to enact a broadly integrative suite of transformative practices, drawing from shamanic and contemplative, entheogenic, philosophical or metaphysical, artistic, narrative, imaginal, somatic, psychoanalytic, cognitive scientific, evolutionary, postmodern hermeneutical, technological, socially liberative traditions. In other words, a big smorgasbord of things. But if you go through that whole list, you can see that they actually cover the four quadrants that Wilbur often talks about. It aims to work generatively, not only across these different cultural domains and practice areas, but also to engage, as Layman mentioned last time, in the internal work of the integration of our subsystems. And taken together, this is sometimes described as exercising and integrating body, mind, and spirit in self, culture, and nature. And for the post-metaphysical piece, this is not really considered essential in all cultural contexts, but for those who are interested in such things, in simple terms, it involves holding spiritual phenomena and attainments inactively in the Santiago school or the 4E cognitive science sense of enactment as autopoietic participatory domains of experience that are available for cultivation and development, while also holding many of the traditional metaphysical associations about God, spirit, kundalini, lightly or in suspension. It doesn't involve a rejection of philosophical metaphysics altogether. Ontology and epistemology remain important domains of reflection, but it does involve a distancing from certain earlier metaphysical presuppositions, such as the metaphysics of presence and so on. And it considers there to be two primary branches of spiritual practice, translative and transformative. Translative spirituality helps with sense-making and horizontal adaptation to, coping with, or thriving in our various situations. And this is achieved through wisdom stories, archetypal models, rituals, and so on. And transformative spirituality is developmentally oriented, focusing on state training, developing perspectival flexibility, self-growth and transcendence, and so on. And both are important, and the line between them is admittedly blurry. Powerfully new translations can be transformative, and transformative experiences can lead to new translations. Formally, the integral spiritual tradition has developed a modular approach to spiritual practice as integral life practice, which includes shadow, body, mind, spirit, ethical, and relational modules, each of which could be filled with any number of practices. But this is mostly taken as a touchstone and not a rigid structure or set of requirements. And there's more to say, and Layman may want to add some things onto that, but I wanted just to pause here, John, and see how this lands with you, or if you'd like to offer some definitions or comparative notes from what you consider to be the religion that's not a religion.
Well, a lot of it's landing for me. The thing, I guess, where I would make the first point of contact and comparison is the translative and transformative tend to correspond to the horizontal and the vertical dimensions within the Neoplatonic dialectic, not Hegelian dialectic, the Neoplatonic dialectical tradition, what I call dialectic into dialogos, to distinguish it from the Hegelian dialectic and bring it in as a definitive practice, not just a conceptual schema. So yeah, so for this, and this, of course, the horizontal has to do with your relationship to other people and to the world in the communing fashion, and then the transcendental has to do with your conformity and transformation to levels of realization, levels of intelligibility. And as you said, the Neoplatonic tradition is sort of explicit in understanding those two as actually deeply interpenetrative. So it doesn't worry about them blurring. It encourages them in a profound sense to bleed into each other and to blur. And I think that does a lot, that captures a lot that can be translated very, very well into 4E cognitive science. Now, I tend to think of, and Layman and I are familiar with this because of Respond, but the idea of the meta curriculum. I talk about design principles. What are the design principles you look for in any good ecology of practices? And if we want, we can talk about that. I think there are design principles, and what this gives you is a proper pluralism. What people find to put into the design principles, of course, is culturally and historically and environmentally variable for them. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean that it's autodidactic or hodgepodge or fragmented, because there is a basic coordination, sort of a Wittgensteinian language game level of agreement on the design principles. I think similarly, and this is where we can make use of a lot of help from both the traditions and CogSci, we can talk about the proper domains of practice. Like what are some of the domain, like, some sort of mindfulness domain, some sort of, psychosomatic movement practice. We can talk about the domains. And then thirdly, I talk a lot about, sorry, that's the wrong sentence. I do a lot of work on, read about and learn about, and then perhaps talk about the normativity on ritual. What is the normativity in ritual such that it makes sense to talk about a rationality of ritual and understand the deep interpenetration between rationality and ritual involving the imaginal, the aspirational, and a bunch of other things. And I'd like to talk about that at some point. And then finally, for me, so there's the design principles, the domains, the normativity. I'm also very interested in a cross-cultural, cross-historical project of trying to get back to the philosophical Silk Road, to use something like Neoplatonism. But I'm now broadening that. I think of Neoplatonism as the synoptic integration of the West, and I think of Zen as the synoptic integration of the East, because it incorporates, of course, Buddhism, Taoism, and elements of Shinto, right. And so I'm actually looking to understand the possibility that's been foreshadowed by the Kyoto School, been foreshadowed by people doing work on Zen Catholicism and Zen Christianity, for a Zen Neoplatonism, where, and I'm deeply influenced by Glendinning's book that I'm reading with Dan Chiappi, Europe, A Philosophical History, part 1, which is, he talks about trying to come up with a new, following Derrida, a new sense of appropriation that is not to make it mine, but to have the Zen and the Neoplatonism to enter into genuine dialogos. So something emerges from both of them that neither one own, but they only own or appropriate in communing with each other and reciprocally reconstructing. And both Zen and Neoplatonism have this tremendous capacity to enter into reciprocal reconstruction with other things. And so the hope is, proper design features, proper domains, proper normativity, and then give an exemplar template for the philosophical Silk Road in something like Zen Neoplatonism. So those are sort of the things I understand as core features of an attempt to explicate the religion that's not a religion. I mean, there's other important features. There's going to be Jordan Holland and I were on Jim Rutt talking about what religion and not religion is, and there's a lot of the critical features there, which are rejects the two worlds mythology, et cetera, that we've discussed quite at length. And I'm not going to talk about those, because I perceive that what we're trying to do now is move away from the proper and deep critique. Here's the constructive response. And so that's why I'm emphasizing these 4 things.
Think back to the last one. I think we left off considering the triad of the imaginal and the ecological and the sacred, and also this prompt to explore the sets of types of practices that should be included in a general ecology for new religio. So I see those, hi Doug, as intricately connected. So the simplest way for me to connect them would be to assume that among the essential set of practices are those which involve imaginal and energetic gestures that facilitate the participatory mode of sacred encounter, and that can be done in different contexts, and that one of the privileged contexts is ecology, both because it's most likely the normative mode of human religion and ritual, which goes much further back than indoors and writing, and also because it addresses the needs of the world historical moment, which has something to do with resetting the anthropological relationship to the ecological. So I'm thinking of imaginal, sacred, ecological practice as part of a privileged subset of the general ecology, which I might term shamanic. I'm also interested in thinking what the broader, comprehensive contemporary ecology might be. I appreciate the work Zach Stein has been doing on putting at least 3 buckets in play around awakening and soulcraft and polymathy, and I would probably want to tweak and clarify those. My sense is 3 is not really enough. I would need 5 or maybe 10 to 15 basic categories, catch everything that I think are the key types of practicing skills needed for flourishing religio. Very interested in what John's bringing up around normative ritual. And my curiosity there would be how we get the sweet spot between replicable patterns and mystery and surprise. Because some of the patterns that are normative will be patterns that we can recognize and detect and clarify, and some of them might be patterns that we don't recognize, which come out of altered states and improvisational practice, where they might be essential aspects of ritual, but not aspects we necessarily know how to name because they come from a different sense-making modality within ourselves. I'm also very curious, as I mentioned, about the environment, the ecology being the normative frame for ritual historically, say over the last 100,000 years, and what aspect of response to environmental factors, even if that's just a tree or a hill or a stone or the mood of the land or going in the water or something like that. To what degree does the specific environmental context predispose what's normative for the ritual that's appropriate in that context? And I liked what you guys were saying about the horizontal and the vertical. And one of the things that brings up for me is the necessity, if in a big picture sense, of viewing the whole set of ecologies from different perspectives. Because I think if you view from, say, the non-dual perspective, you get what John called encouraging the vertical and the horizontal to bleed together. Like a key feature of non-dual logic is to suggest you can't really make that vertical horizontal distinction. And so that would be looking at the whole set, looking at the structures within the field that we consider to be the general set of religious practices from different kinds of perspectives, which would add different forms of meaning to that set. So we might want to think about like the kind of meta set of lenses that are included within religio as valid ways of viewing its set of practices, so to speak. I'm rambling a little bit now. That's enough for the moment.
I didn't find it rambling at all. I found it completely coherent. That was good. So I'm a little. I'm not. We have a poverty of riches here. There's multiple ways in which we could try to pursue connecting what we're talking about, and I'm wondering if we could somehow collectively decide which thread to initially pick up. I'm open to. I know what I would like to talk about, but I'm also very alive that there's a lot here, and it can weave in many different ways.
Well, I would love to hear you speak to the process of getting an optimal grip between locked down normative ritual practices and the constant need to open up ritual practices to keep them from getting too locked down.
Sure.
I had exactly the same question. That's great.
Okay, so I mean, first of all, and this is in Stenberger's sense, we need the proper orientation, which is all ritual. I will propose this orientation, which is ritual is always for the sake of enhancing religio. Ritual is for ratio religio, and I think that's one of the things, right? And for me, this is one of the gifts of Zen, which is its constant privileging of religio over credo as a fundamental part of its grammar. And I think that's, for example, and I'm not going to go through all the details, that's something that Zen can offer Neoplatonism, and because Neoplatonism can contend to an overemphasis on the propositional, and you can see that even within Christian Neoplatonism. So that sort of orientation, I think, because you should always work your way into your normativity. What's the fundamental orientation such that you start to navigate? So you have to have an orientation, and then within that there are the constraints of navigation, and this is how you properly, I would argue, get a normativity. So this is following on the work of Jennings and William and Boyd and Schilbrecht, and there's a whole new movement on within academia that's largely not known about, which is all about ritual knowing, and about the rationality of ritual and the normativity within it. And it plugs very well, often explicitly and intentionally so, into 4E Cog Sci. So I'll try and give you what I think is a synoptic integration of this constellation of work. And of course, inevitably, there'll be a Vervaekean spin on it at places. And so I can't not do that. So the idea is Jennings' original idea. This will take me a couple minutes. Is that okay? Because this is
Sure.
a deep topic. All right. So Jennings' original idea is the point of ritual is to find the fitting action. And I think that's important. And it's clear, and he means it in a way that's very, very consonant with notions of relevance, realization, and getting an optimal grip. And what you're doing is basically setting up a situation of play, serious play, so you can play with various ways of trying to get fitted actions. Well, that in and of itself is, of course, insufficient, and there's a lot more I want to add to it. But he then says, okay, but what's the normativity on this? And then he comes up with something that I think is very pertinent. And it spoke to an issue I've been wrestling with, which is, what's the difference between flow in a video game and flow in Tai Chi Chuan? And we talked a little bit about this. And then he explicitly argues for it. So I found like, oh, wow, that's really cool. Which is, the normativity is that which is transfer appropriate in the sense that it transfers broadly and widely to multiple domains in your life. You can think of that sort of the horizontal. It also transfers broadly and widely to the vertical. And that not only means beyond the ego, but below the ego. So the full vertical axis. And it also, I'm adding to this, right? I'm unpacking what could be meant by transfer. And it also transfers to that third, the binding dimension, the bleed dimension between. Now, I think that's half, maybe a third. Williams and Boyd say, that's right, there are exploratory phases of ritual where ritual is exploring the world. And what you're trying to do, right, is you're trying to fit to reality in some important way. But they say there's also a counter movement within ritual, in which ritual becomes like a masterpiece or a work of art that you then are constantly trying to transform yourself to. And then they make the, I think, brilliant suggestion that they don't do much with, which is, well, ritual is actually constantly playing between, this is a masterpiece, oh no, I need to find something new. This is a masterpiece, I need to find something new. And so I think if you have both of those movements and you can talk about transfer appropriate processing, I would then add this. I think ritual properly makes use of the imaginal that affords that transfer appropriate processing in a way that integrates the four kind of knowings into the vertical dimension and actually affords, right, a reciprocal opening between you and the world. So it's not just transfer. I think that's insufficient. I think a ritual not just transfers and applies. I think a ritual carries the sacredness with it because skills can transfer broadly and apply. But a ritual has this capacity. It always, when it transfers, it carries you into the reciprocal opening. And the reciprocal opening carries both of those moments, the moment of outward exploration and the moment of inward conforming to the masterpiece of the ritual. And so I think when the imaginal affords indwelling internalization in transfer appropriate processing broadly across those three domains that affords reciprocal opening comprehensively so that we have thereby the enhancement of religio, and it's been constrained, ratio religio, such that it is optimal for human flourishing. That's the normative standard on a ritual. So it's a complex normativity, but I think it precisely needs to be a complex normativity because I'm trying to explicate what I think is actually implicit in the optimal use of ritual. Now, notice what I just said. There are, of course, all kinds of ways, like any other human endeavor, in which this can be hijacked, perverted, twisted, misappropriated, used for tyranny and deception. We're talking about the ideal because that's what the normative addresses. It addresses the ideal, and of course, there's always the gap between the ideal and the real. But I'm trying to answer the normative question here. And so, for me, you start with the orientation of the enhancement of religio, and then you put this navigational framework on it that is always like moving towards reciprocal opening and flourishing. And that is what is playing with these two motions of ritual, the exploration and the masterpiece, the reverence of the masterpiece, constantly playing between them. That's how I would say you ultimately get your optimal grip within ritual endeavor. So the imaginal enhancement of indwelling and internalization, broad and deep transfer across the three dimensions that is always within the orientation towards the enhancement of religio and the realization of human flourishing by reciprocal opening, satisfying the two meta desires of peace, inner peace, and outer contact with reality, with what is most real. That's my proposal.
In your own work with students and in the workshops that you've done, have you found any particular practices to help you realize that optimal grip? I imagine there's a degree of improvisation that needs to be left open while there's also a structure provided. And what has your experience been so far?
My experience has been that, I've come out of this with a rather strong proposal that there is no panacea practice, which is why I've proposed the ecology of practices. And I think I can make both a good historical and cross-cultural argument from tradition and a current argument from the cognitive science of meaning making and sense making for exactly that argument. I'm not going to repeat all those arguments. I'm going to take it that I've at least made a case that's plausible. And so I don't think of any practice as realizing this. I think of, like I say, I think of certain design principles within an ecology of practice that help to realize this. And so that's what I've been looking for. And here's the idea about trying to conform as much to the grammar of cognition as possible. And then there's the underlying argument that grammar must fundamentally participate in the grammar of reality, or we're locked into solipsism and skepticism. So I'm going to take that argument right? And that's a shared deep proposition of Zen and Neoplatonism, right? And so for me, the things to look for are, and I've talked about this before, practices that are in proper ratio, proper opponent processing with each other, in which you can explicitly say, here's its strengths and weaknesses, and then here is the complementary set of strengths and weaknesses, and we can put these against each other, and that's how you're going to get optimal grip. That's the adaptive process for optimal gripping. And of course, you want these layered, like think about a natural ecology, they're layered in terms of sets of, so like they're nested. So within mindfulness, there's opponent processing between, meditation and contemplation. And then within that, there's opponent processing between still practices and moving practices. And then there's opponent processing between all of that and active, open-minded, rational, reflective exercises, so that you're doing the proper opponent processing between the inference and the insight machinery. This is not exhaustive. I hope you understand this. This is exemplary of the kind of design features. So you have that nesting of opponent processing, which reflects the nested recursive opponent processing that is fundamental to the grammar of cognition. But then, of course, there's the temporal dimension. You want to properly have a proper, and I think justifiable, program of onboarding people into an ecology of practices. There's an order of operations that has to be developmentally sensitive to individuals. Layman has emphasized this repeatedly, and I think correctly, and that that has to have all the pedagogical care we bring to our other pedagogical projects, not just, oh, well, we'll just do that and I'll run off some intuitive model. No, we have to get what's the most pedagogically justifiable order of operations. So you have the nesting, you have the opponent processing, you have the pedagogy, and then I talk about, a meta feature, which is, I think, any ecology of practices needs to be in a top-down, bottom-up relationship with a meta practice, a dialogical practice that is explicitly around activating and deducing and educating the collective intelligence of distributed cognition towards collective wisdom. And that is in bottom-up, top-down relationship, a vital one with ecologies of practices. Now, I want to say again, I do not think that those are the complete design principles. I'm not claiming that. What I'm claiming, though, is everything I've said has deep resonance with how the cognition of the grammar of the cognition of sense making and intelligibility is operating. And I think we now are at a place where we have enough history and we have enough science that we can much more explicitly do these kinds of design principles. And so for me, what I've noticed is when those design principles are in place, that I see the kind of stuff I was talking about. I see the emergence, often spontaneous. I saw this a lot when I was in Rafe's Return to the Source, of ritual that has a lot of these features I was talking about. So I think rituals have to be properly situated within these kinds of design features. And then we can at some point talk about domains. And then we can, like I said, we can talk about how do we make this genuinely cross-cultural. And that's what I'm talking about with trying to get something like the intellectual Silk Road going again. Sorry, that was a long answer, but that's how I see it. I haven't found, there is no practice that doesn't have a dark side. I've not seen one, and I can't think of any a priori argument that would give me reason to believe that such a practice is possible. And one of the problems I find in the West is because of our desire for commodification and ease of market transaction, we keep proposing the panacea practice. The panacea practice that taps into the perfect faculty, which is a tremendous form of bullshit that has become very pervasive in the so-called spiritual marketplace. Here's the one thing you need to do because it taps into X, magical faculty, your intuition, your imagination, your emotion, blah, 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 blah. And I think that almost always generates spiritual bypassing and other terrific problems that beset what is meant by spirituality today. Sorry, that got a little polemical, but we're touching upon really central stuff.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing for me around the panacea, because it's a marketing trick in two senses. One sense is the richness of an ecology of practices can't possibly be reduced to a single tactic.
Yes.
But the other part is it's not supposed to succeed. You're supposed to have to buy another one next year, right? You can get the new panacea every time.
I hadn't thought about that temporal dimension. That's fantastic, Layman. Yeah, I mean, fantastically evil. But I mean, yeah, your insight is really astute. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. And those two reinforce each other. I take it that to be your point. You know, it's like Fromm's critique, right? And Freud around fetishism, right? By reducing it to a single thing, right? It draws you in with the salience of its bullshit, but it also frustrates you because it can't possibly do what it promises. So then you are hungry for the next thing. That's very, very astute. That's a very powerful critique. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, that's what I meant to say. The other thing that came up for me, and again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is, you know, how do we think about this cross-culturally? What domains are the design principles? And I would include skill sets and orientation and motivation in that. Where are they situated? I think it's really important to think environmentally and ecologically about that, because that's the way our ancestors evolved to do this. And there's a big difference in terms of trying to negotiate. Say you're walking along, right? And you're trying to conform to the normal way of walking, or you're going to throw a little bit of play in and you're going to go back and forth and try to find a sweet spot. But it still makes a difference whether you're doing that on a hard, flat sidewalk or supportive, uneven ground. They have very different consequences. They sort of tilt the background of the attempt to get the optimal grip in that regard. So there may be a sense in which if the masterpieces we're playing off are overly simplified human social creations, we may be at a certain risk. And it may be that if the masterpiece is rich, complex, somewhat unpredictable ecological environments, that might mitigate against that risk.
I agree. I in fact, one of the things that has become one of my deep sort of convictions out of this year is, I think, these three things interrelated, you know, connection to nature, going into the natural environment, but also a deep ecological appreciation. I think, for example, we can't just talk about it theoretically. Again, that's like just reading the Kama Sutra. We really need to see, and we need to see, you know, situated seeing of ecologies in nature in order to deeply temper, in both senses of the word, our normativity on ecologies of practices. So first of all, it has that function. Secondly, it has the function which you just said, which is it plugs into our deep evolutionary history. And this is something that Rafe Kelly, of course, talks about a lot about. And therefore, that is the most proper place in which we should seek and educate our senses of connectedness. And so I think one of the proper domains that has been, and I think this is more Western than Eastern, if those adjectives land in any way. But I think that the ecological, environmental connection with nature is a proper domain that has tended to be ignored in Western spirituality to a significant degree. And as you say, we tend to read books inside buildings in a way. No, we shouldn't stop doing that either. And you're not saying that, but so, you know, people readily get, oh yeah, mindfulness should be a domain, and there should be some sort of dialogical thing, and there should be movement practice. Like there's many that you can easily garner just by looking at a lot of traditions. But this one, I think it's so important because of, like I said, the way it gives us the template by which we temper the normativity in an enacted way of what an ecology is. Secondly, the connectedness to the environment is fundamental from our evolutionary history. And then third, the pertinence of this for facing X-rays. I think this has to be really emphasized as one of the domains in which ecologies of practices and the meta practices are applied such that rituals emerge within that domain for the group of people practicing those ecology practice. This has become absolutely clear to me. In fact, I now say I think it's a failing feature of any proposed ecology of practices if it does not have this domain within it.
And my question to you about if you'd had any practices that showed up for you in that way. I live in California, the workshop capital of the world. So I definitely am weary of those kinds of programs. But I was really looking to see if you'd had any, I was wanting to ask, have you had any particular experiences in your work with people where you found those things click together? Not to say, okay, now this is the forever model, but to have that, those instances where you really felt that that magic happening in the between of the different opponent processing and different elements that you've just been describing. And one thing I'll just throw in also is speaking about the environmental, ecological, and kind of the necessarily exploratory dimensions of this. There's something called participatory spirituality and cooperative inquiry by a guy named John Heron. And they do a lot of intersubjective practices, and they do things that he calls lean ritual. But their idea is to basically take a ritual sensibility and construct a very loose container in which people have a range of things that they can do within that context, but they always let it be kind of like an improvisational emergent thing that happens as much outside as inside. And it typically involves imaginal play, dialogical work, embodied movement, sound and music, different forms of interactivity, and often, an invitation to ritualize ordinary objects like that tree or like a key in your pocket, whatever, that they can be alive to elements of the world in their symbolic dimension, so that they can enter dialogically into relationship with the different elements of the world, which I think can be transferred out into ordinary kinds of interactions later when you really develop that sensibility. Maybe Jean, a Michel Serres way of looking at elements of nature as well. I won't get into that track. That may be another thing to go into later. But yeah, just wanted to see what you thought there.
So, first of all, it was participatory spirituality and cooperative
inquiry.
Cooperative inquiry.
John Heron.
John Heron. I'd like to look that up. So for me, that captures sort of the Jennings side of ritual, the emergent, improv, exploratory. But Williams and Boyd, because what they did is they went in and they're anthropologists, and they did genuine ethnographic work on Zoroastrian ritual, and they found that many of the people that practice the ritual while they acknowledge this dimension, there are entire phases where they say, no, the point is not me to create something. The point is for me to be recreated by the ritual. And so this is what I mean about this dialectic between let's call it creation and recreation. And this is again, they talk about the fun, and they do it explicitly. They talk about they use the analogy of the aesthetic masterpiece as something against which the artist can measure themselves and continually see how they're doing in an important way. And so while I like what you just said, for me, it still seems like one half.
Part of it, yeah.
Right. And it's a half. And I understand, I would say in response to them that that's the half that needs to be emphasized right now, because we're in this, post legacy religion phase, and we're in an exploratory phase. And so that needs to be emphasized. But I do think that there is an important function to the recreation, which is this training in the ascesis sense, the spiritual exercise training of the coordinated and interpenetrating virtues of humility and reverence that you experience when you come before the masterpiece. And of course, one of the dangers right now, especially in our secularized sewage of culture, is that irreverence has become paramount, just the way cynicism has become paramount. And of course, this is all part of the hermeneutics of suspicion, and which I think is very problematic. So I do like this, and I even will acknowledge that creative aspect, the emergence, exploratory, needs to be emphasized right now. But we also need to be able to feel called by and called to masterpieces, to which we are properly humbled and reverent in order to, because I think spirituality that is not deeply grounded in the aspiration, the paradoxical aspiration to humility and reverence, and they're just two sides of the same orientation axis, I would argue, that's where you're going to get the opposite of all the reductive nihilisms. You're going to get the often inflationary, spurious spiritualities that lead to spiritual bypassing, that lead to spiritual narcissism, spiritual materialism, and I think there's a lot of that going on right now. And towards Layman's point, that's often complicit with some pretty noxious socioeconomic patterns that are designed to exploit these people and keep them in that mode, so that they can be exploited and manipulated, whether politically or economically. So I actually, first of all, I'm very interested, and I'm trying to learn as much as I can from, and that's why I wanted to know the names. But I feel the second movement, precisely because it is not emphasized right now, but is needed, is the one that I'm finding most challenging to articulate in a fashion that does not simply fall back into nostalgia or utopic thinking, which is, how do we point to and feel called by the masterpieces of ritual and practice? Did that make sense as an argument to a question?
For me, it does, yes. And I've been involved for years in Tibetan practice, which of course is highly ritual. And
Yes.
There's a way that I was able to get into the regular ritual practice because I probably, like you, growing up in the West, going to churches,
Yes.
there was a lot of ritual which was completely empty and lifeless,
Yes.
just mere repetition and going through the motion. And so I think one reason why something like John Heron's approach is attractive for a number of people in the West is because it looks like a way of doing ritual that breaks out of the rote, deadening repetition. And yet, if in something like Tibetan tradition, where you can do something like the Nundro practice, where there's 9 different practices, and you've got to do each one of those practices 100,000 times each. So that's a huge number of repetitions. And yet they're done in a way that is so beautiful, so individually, personally evocative, that for me, there's been a continual sense of engagement as I explored with those things. And thinking about the enactive sensibility, the sense that autopoetically we enact regimes of experience, ritual then I see as reenactment, that there's a participation in a deep historical current of self-becoming, that just that little framing helps me sit more easily within the more formalized ritual space.
So what was it? What is it? What was it, and what is it about the Tibetan tradition that tempers you that way, and tempers your temperament, and acts as a template, and deliberately playing with all the etymological connections between those words, right? Like, so obviously you're treating it like I'm talking about. You're treating it like a masterpiece, something that you are conforming to and letting it recreate you, rather, right? So like, and Bruce, sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it's a really open-hearted question. Like, what is it? And I ask it within a framework because I know you believe this, that you're not claiming this is the only masterpiece, this is the only way, right? And so I'm trying to get at what are the features of it. Are they, like, first of all, some of them are idiosyncratic, and that's just it, right? And that's fine. But it would be helpful if there were general principles that we could speak to everybody about, like, what is it that legitimates it for you as a ritual, as a set of ritual masterpieces, or masterpiece rituals, perhaps is a better way of putting it.
It's hard to name, because even in thinking about some things I would name, I can see that obviously those things are present in a lot of other contexts that don't speak to me quite the same way. But I do think one is the sheer variety of practices and rituals that they have, that there's a real sense that you actually are in an ecology of ritual, because there are so many different practices that have been collected over the years, and they're all part of the palette that you can paint with. So it's not like you just go in every Sunday and you do the exact same thing again and again, but there's a rich suite of different ways of ritually working with material. So that's one, Damon, is just the sheer variety of practices, and it's actually overwhelming. That's also a downside to it. Sometimes it's easy to get lost because there are actually so many practices. But one of the things that for me has kind of inspired a kind of awe is in entering into that, to discover that actually they already have a practice for this and a practice for that and a practice for that, and that they've actually thought through all of these things in a really deep way and had many, many, many layers of ways of working with the imagination and the body and the voice and the heart and intention. And all of those things are marshaled typically together in a coordinated way that feels integrating and synthesizing, where there's deliberate instruction to merge different aspects of your enactment together in the enactment, so that you feel a greater multidimensionality around the enactment. So, just like a simple practice is, of breathing and attending to sounds in nature, and being mindful. And one of the practices there would be to wed the three of those things within your throat center as you're breathing, so that you're aware of the flow of awareness, you're aware of the flow of breath, and you're aware of the flow of sound. And those things are brought together and integrated in a way. So that's just an example on a small scale of the whole way of working that I think that multidimensional synthetic approach makes it engaging and makes it feel like there are continually horizons to discover of experience.
Well, I have two questions then. One is, do you think that multidimensional complexity helps satisfy the normativity on ritual? Like, I'm wondering if the intuitively selected masterpieces actually exemplify the normative principles I was talking about. But I didn't want to frame the question that way because I wanted you to answer the question as unbiased as possible. But now I can ask it since you've given your answer. And then related, although it might not seem to be, is how do you how does the tradition prevent diffuse dilettantism or dabbling, right? How does it, right? Well, it's so complex, and I like this little bit, and I like this little bit, and I like this little bit. So what does it do to counteract that? which of course is, well, I've given arguments before about why that ultimately undermines the cultivation of wisdom, etc.
I think mostly it's working in small groups and with teachers in which there's a kind of awareness of what each other are doing.
Okay, so that prevents the dabbling. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
What do
Yeah.
you think about the first question I asked you? Do you think that I'm trying to see, because that would be a good test on the normativity, if the normativity helps predict the things that get selected as masterpieces. Because you said it was a living tradition and it's multidimensional. Does that mean it transfers to many domains in your life, and you also find it, transferring between many levels of your psyche, getting the conscious and the unconscious to talk to each other more readily, etc.? Is that what's happening for you?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think it is. There's a much greater sense within the tradition that the body is a palette that can be worked with creatively.
Right.
And so I think we talked about in an earlier conversation where in the West, we tend to feel an emotion is real only if it happens to you and you're a passive receiver of it.
Yes.
And within this tradition, it's much more of a palette that you can work with and you can deliberately stimulate and cultivate. And so you're not just waiting to be hit by grace, but grace can happen. But at the same time, you're also invited into a more creative, interactive play with a lot richer dimensionality of experience. So I think, yeah, that invitation to enact, certain, ritual practices in that way invites a way of working that definitely bleeds out into how you deal with distractions, how you relate to dreams, what you can do in relationships. I definitely feel that.
I think one of the most important definitions of the sacred is its ability to transfer transformatively into the profane, the domains of the profane, without becoming identified with the domains of the profane. Do you feel like that's happening, so that what you're doing in your practice affects, mundane, profane things that you're doing on a daily basis?
Yeah, there's often a sense of walking in the world, especially after doing one of those practices, where the whole world feels like this sacred arena that you've just been working in. So you imaginally build the sacred arena within the ritual practice, then you go out the door and the whole world is showing up as sacred arena in that same mode, at least for a while.
Thank you. Your answers have been really insightful and helpful, but I want to make space now for Layman.
Yeah, I think one of the things a good ritual pattern does is show you a sort of mandala that represents the psychological and external cosmos. And so patterns like that are generated by people intentionally and inadvertently throughout their cultural life. And I think one of the places of penetration from ritual back into mundane life is the ability to recognize those patterns all over the place, right? Where we see colors, where we see collections, where we see circles, that reminds us of sort of the all-inclusive patterning that was in the ritual form. I think some of the other features are the aesthetics is a huge feature, right? Tibetan is notably good at that. It looks awesome. It looks crisp. It's colorful. When you put on the costume, you're called to something a little bit higher, so that if you had improvisational impulses, you would have to vet them to make sure they hit the level of the aesthetic that you're participating in.
Right.
It's so lovely that it has a momentum that protects it, makes you want to honor it. And I think that's true also of place, whether that's in the beautiful temple or in nature in a particular area where rituals are instantiated, because we have a sort of notion that rituals could be packed up and dropped off anywhere. That's a very modern way to think. But our ancestors did particular rituals in particular spots, and those spots gave them feeling qualities, and those feeling qualities constrained the dilettantism that might otherwise come up because you were living up to an impressive feeling that you were all having in that spot. I think also and particularly from the integration surplus idea, that a good ritual is proposing to you that you do several things internally that have to be harmonized and integrated. That might be quite a variety of practices. Some of the Tibetan rituals have many things you have to track simultaneously, and that puts you at your edge in terms of what you can track. And then traditionally, it seems to me the most basic way to think about it is, are there physical, emotional, and mental activities that you have to do simultaneously in order to participate in the ritual? Mm-hmm. I think that's a huge feature. I'm also interested in where the patterning comes from. Like I mentioned, the mandalas, I think that's part of it. It strikes me that there are conscious and unconscious sources of the patterning that we then have to hold more as a masterpiece and more as an improvisational opportunity. Mm-hmm. And that patterning can come from places we don't understand. Like if we venerate the ancestors and venerate nature and have an interactive feel about it, then we're sort of being shaped by that interaction. We don't necessarily know the pattern that it's trying to give to us, but by going through it, we become patterned in that form, and that becomes transcribed into the ritual. But there's also this sense, I think, that the occult traditions have, which is the form of the ritual can be thought out to be a microcosm of the moment of growth, of a transformational initiatory or insight experience can be demonstrated in the circuit board of the ritual. So I think there's a way to think it out rationally, and there's a way to receive it as an imprint of the world around us, and both of those have to work together to give the shape to what the ritual actually does.
Mm-hmm. That's very good. That's very good. Do you
I
think?
agree with the aesthetic piece.
Yeah, I do too. I think that's important. And it sounds also like there's the aesthetic piece. There's something like, putting enough demands on the person so that they're liable to get into something like the flow state, which optimizes for insight and optimizes for good implicit learning, etc. And it seems to me like that's also something like we're looking for in rituals, right? That they, and I think those two go together in an important way. Like you can just load demand on people, and that might put them into the flow state, right? But like they want to have to commit deeply. So, Layman, tell me if this is working. I'm trying to integrate these two features that you mentioned together: the aesthetics and the multidimensionality. The multidimensionality is what you need, right? But you also need sort of clear feedback, right, and other things in order for the flow state. And I'm seeing that, and you also need to be drawn into the demand. You want to undertake the demand on you. So I'm trying to see the aesthetics and the multidimensionality as like integrated insofar as they are conducive to putting people into a flow state. And it doesn't have to be hot flow. It can be cool flow, on some kind of flow state.
Yeah, the way I would think about that would be in terms of the aesthetic of harmonized complexity or integration more generally, right? So if you're demonstrating an aesthetic, you're demonstrating that many parts are coming together to produce a package that resonates really cleanly and produces more than the sum of its parts. So you're like, that's the target state you're going for. And it helps you organize the way you hold the different systems that are going to create the complexity that hold you at the edge of that flow state. But it also provokes the urge to participate, because when you see that being pulled off, it's impressive. You're like, wow, I'd like to be able to do it up to that level.
Yeah. Good. That's what I was proposing. That's and you said it back very well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the aesthetics are like the flower that draws the bee in, right? And the multidimensionality of it does keep you at that creative edge. I was thinking very literally of a Tibetan practice where part of the ritual is you imagine that you have a crystalline base, and that your body with all the sense doors, each one is a flower. And then every sense perception coming in is imagined to be a golden bee with a turquoise head feeding at the nectar of that sense door. And so you're actually trying to hold all of these multiple images at once while holding certain postures, while doing certain kind of breathing. So it's asking a big demand on the expenditure of your resources to coordinate all of these things together. But the evocativeness of the imagery and the multidimensionality, I think, is exactly doing that thing that you were just describing.
Cool. And I've got the book Evocative Objects. I haven't read it yet, but it's the evocative and of course vocal, calling to you, right? It's the evocative nature of the aesthetics that is also something that really intrigues me. What does that look like? And of course, it has to allow for considerable range of variation because there's going to be idiosyncratic factors and historical, cultural factors. But maybe there are. I mean, maybe I should read the damn book. Like, what's the best proposal about what it is that makes an evocative object such, and then that could be also incorporated into the normativity of ritual. So there's extra things coming in here. This stuff about aesthetics, flow, the evocativeness of the setting and of the objects. Gentlemen, I have to go. I have to go soon. Sorry, I want to hear what you have to say, Layman, but then
my last remark then. I have the image of a kind of gradient in provocative objects, right? It might go from something like exoteric to esoteric because our familiarity, and if we metacognitively map our experience of provocative and evocative objects, we may be able to abstract that and gain the possibility of sort of projecting that quality onto other ranges of perception.
Yes.
Right. So that would slide. A smaller number of ritual participants would be able to move in that direction. And most people would be reliant upon the aesthetics and the experience and the objects to give them that. But there is sort of a growth spectrum that's possible there in terms of maybe exapting the experience of what a provocative object is.
That's well said. I agree with that. I don't have any. That I think that's well said. I think the idea that there's a continuum from the esoteric to the mundane, even.
So the aesthetic and the esoteric next time, maybe.
I would like that. I mean, I'd like to understand. Yaden has done some work on this. We might want to take a look at it. The sense of being called. Because there seems to be a connection between sort of aesthetic evocativeness and provocation and the sense of being called, which bleeds between the mundane and the sacred in important ways.
Wonderful.
Well, that also points to, like the moments in your life when you are more in need of ritual is an additional consideration. Right? It might not be equally for everyone all the time. It might be that it's for certain moments or certain desperations even. Sorry to cut you off, Bruce.
Yes. Often when people are confronting mortality and impermanence and tragedy, it seems like, in fact, I was watching an episode of The Crown where they're covering the event where in Wales where the tip collapsed and it killed all these kids in a public school, and the need for ritual around those events. That for me, Layman, that's one dimension of the sense of being called. I think the two actually can be spoken of together, right? What calls us? What calls us to aspiration, but also what calls us to like proper responsibility and proper response? Or well, we'll work it out. My language is, I'm not happy with the language I'm using. But nevertheless, what I'm just suggesting is I think those two things are actually interconnected in an important way.
I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you both. And look forward to meeting again, maybe next month.
I am very happy to do so. I find these conversations are integral, no pun intended, to my project of trying to understand the religion that's not a religion, trying to understand ecologies of practices, trying to understand ritual, everything that I'm deeply concerned with right now. I find that these are deeply facilitatory and enriching conversations towards those ends. So thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
See you both soon.
All right, take care.